All right, I'm here with Peter and Finn. Say hi, fellas.
Hi.
I
Yeah. So Finn, you had an interesting path to coming into Zed because you actually came into Zed through the open source contributions. Like first, you got started making contributions to Zed, and then we reached out and talked to you, and one thing led to another, and now you're an employee of Zed.
yeah.
So let's just start off by talking about this topic of how to become an open source contributor by just telling your story. Like, how did you personally get into contributing to open source?
Well, it's probably like it's sort of a longer story, but it started when I and a friend of mine we like looked for some way to collaborate via an editor, and well, the first thing at hand was like the Visual Studio Code integration. So I think it's live share. I haven't used it for a while, but the issue we had with it was that it always broke in some way. So we had like these issues where when we were working in the same document, we ran into issues where if you press Control Z for one time, it broke, and so that came to the point where we like spent hours just debugging stuff because at one point one of us pressed Control Z unconscious and it broke and we didn't notice, and it took us like an hour later we ran into the issue and no one remembered what happened there. So we started looking into other software to use for collaborating on code. And we tried various platforms, including Visual Studio, the solution, and other stuff. And eventually we landed on Zed, I think. I think it was because I saw a Fireship post when shortly before the Linux version came out. And then we gave it a shot, and it instantly worked better than everything we've had before at that point. So all the issues we had within Visual Studio Code went away. They were just not there in that because of the CRDT stuff. I think there are like some blog posts and talks about that as well. So that just worked out of the box. And then we started using it, and I started using it more both in work, other stuff. And eventually, I think I came around to some other issues there, like smaller ones. And after like using it for some time and having a look at the repo, because it was obviously it's open source compared to other software, I eventually came to the point of, well, couldn't I just fix what I found earlier that day, basically? Because like for me, I think I'm not too bad in finding bugs in software, and generally it annoys me that I'm like running into this bug. I have to live with it all the time. Some bugs never get fixed, or like it takes a year to fix, but you're just sitting, well, this name is undefined, please fix it. Not like I'll fix it at some point and just don't keep it there. And like because that was open source, I eventually came to the idea that, well, I can just take a look at it myself. So from my perspective, I like enjoyed this idea of I ran into a bug earlier that day, and eventually I like took a look at it and tried fixing it myself later in the afternoon because, well, from my experience, it was something where I had fun doing so. And at some point, it just like became more and more because I enjoyed doing it. I got feedback from reviewers, and also the stuff got merged, so that was quite an enjoyable experience for me. And so it just became more and more of doing more, getting more involved on like also different platforms. So the Discord server partially, and like also some looking at other issues like other issues where other people ran into, and sometimes I like could see, oh well, I've just looked at that code, why don't I take another look? So I got more and more used to collaborating, or not collaborating, fixing more and more, just because I like enjoyed the idea that I could fix bugs and not just look at them every day and feel like, well, I could fix it. And these kids, I could just like go ahead and fix them myself. And so basically, this was how I got started, I think.
Okay, so it was for you. It was not like, I mean, I know some people will do it because they're just sort of like, oh, this is a fun hobby project. Like I want to. They sit down and they're like, my goal is I want to make an open source contribution. But for you, it sounded like it was the opposite. For you, it was like you'd use some other pieces of software and the collaboration experience was not great. You used Zed and the collaboration experience was great, but there were other things that you ran into that were, pain points for you, and you were like, hey, why don't I just go fix these myself because I can.
I think it's like the idea that I had the possibility to basically fix what I ran into and not just like sit there and be like, well, that's just how it is for the next year or two or months or whatever the time period is,
Right.
because no one knows. And I like just enjoyed the concept of having a software I could like I could fix a bug, and 2 weeks later I would run into it on stable. Eventually it would just take 1 week because I would use preview, and at some point I found the nightly link, and then I could just basically have another look once it landed in nightly whether everything worked out there.
Right. Well, so that dovetails into an interesting sort of side topic, which is Now, you were using this because you had a problem and Zed fixed the problem for you, and then the bug fix was a solution to a problem within Zed. But of course, a lot of open source contributions are maybe accepted, maybe not accepted, depending on how useful they are to everybody. So if it's a bug fix that's affecting everybody, hey, maybe that's no problem. But Peter, I'm guessing you, having wrangled a whole lot of open source contributions in the Zed code base, you probably have a good amount of experience talking about like what works and what doesn't in terms of people saying like, okay, I've showed up with this contribution. What do you see as sort of some characteristics that make a given contribution more or less likely to actually be accepted?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of different approaches for how projects handle merging PRs and sort of, shepherding them along the way. But in particular, I think smaller scoped PRs are always going to be easier to review and so easier to merge. I think when one of the things that can be a little bit problematic is oftentimes people, when they dive into something, they go, oh, I can also, while I'm here, add this new functionality, change this other thing, change this data structure because I think this is better, or change. And you end up, instead of having a thing where it's like, there's a very clear, there was a behavior that was broken, or there's a behavior you desire that we haven't actually implemented, and then someone can evaluate that. If you are, the larger your PR is, the harder it is to sort of have someone who has the merge rights to really feel confident in what they're doing and being able to test it. And I think that also goes to one of my sort of things is that it's difficult as an open source contributor to step into a project because you don't know the dynamics. Even if you've read some of the old issues or PR comments, it's not always immediately clear how a project operates and what the process might be and what the expectations are. But in my experience as someone who's been doing open source contributions long before I was at Zed and managing that, starting small and really trying to do as little as possible. If you find a problem with white space that you want to fix that's really small, don't also fix another bug. Submit the white space PR so somebody goes, I obviously have to merge this. And then you can fix the bug where it's like, because that's formatted correctly, I can clearly show you a diff of how you had it wrong or whatever, and build on that incrementally. And I think that is difficult for a lot of folks because once they break into a project, they focus on a PR that they're working on. And I think sometimes it makes sense to focus on a small PR or multiple small PRs, sort of building incrementally and building rapport with the people that, for example, with Finn's things, certainly the first time we saw a PR from Finn, I'm not exactly sure when, I haven't gone back to look at your history. That's very different from the 20th PR that we see from you because there's some rapport of what you work on. Are you somebody who's just pushing the support for, esoteric Rust analyzer features, or are you someone who is tackling, just like, this is a bug, I fixed it.
Yeah, Finn, do you remember? I mean, it's been a while since your first foray into contributing to Zed, but do you remember like what it was like, sort of getting a feel for like how the code base works, but also just what the expectations are in terms of contributions and sort of like what the dynamic is? Like I remember you mentioned Discord, but was there any other way that you figured out like how do things work in this repo in this community?
Well, like it's obviously perfect personal preference to some point. I personally like just had a look at it first, how generally the look is. I think other folks might have already seen it, but we've got some people who will look at the PR titles that they match a certain style and stuff like this. So I had like a more, because I enjoy it myself, I had like more of a look, how does it generally work, looking through the history, and also how is it generally touched, and then I tried giving it a step myself in some smaller stuff at the thing. And I think actually the first thing I touched was the docs issue I ran into. And then I like.
It was actually, I just looked it up. It was, it's a year ago tomorrow. Is your first? So this is the
wow
1 year anniversary of your opening a PR against Zed. And you did a couple docs PRs, and then I actually merged your third PR of, some, changing some defaults that had been out of date. So I think that's also a great way to start to get involved with a project is if you are learning from the docs and find they are incorrect or find that they are lacking, those are small incremental fixes that people are very happy to see, even if it's an extra sentence that clarifies things or removing something that no longer applies. Those become easy fixes that are just positive benefits to the community. There's not a lot of risk in accepting a documentation PR change from someone, even if it's wrong. Like the risk is relatively low compared to code changes where we have to be a little more careful.
Yeah, docs are a classic, I would say, way to get into a code base. So let's talk about sort of bridging the gap between like different levels of sort of being a contributor or being able to contribute to the code base. So if like docs and white space and little sort of cleanups are maybe the first level, maybe the second level is, Peter, you mentioned bug fixes are often a really good way to get in, just because it's really clear that people want that contribution. Like it's like, this is a bug, we've acknowledged it's a bug, there's an issue about the bug, that it's like broken, and also it's obvious what the fix is. But then you start getting into higher and higher levels where it's sort of like, well, now we have some like a new feature that that you're implementing, and now there's sort of design questions, and how do you make sure that you're gonna do the design that is what people actually want. So Finn, let's start with you. I'm just curious about what was your experience like, as you remember, going from those much smaller, narrowly scoped PRs to sort of getting your feet wet with like and feeling more comfortable making bigger and bigger contributions without worrying maybe that they were going to get rejected for not being what we actually wanted.
Well, I think it depends. I had like most or like many bug fixes where I basically started with an introduction and like half of a letter, because for some we had issues, but also some issues like they just described the issue and not what the root cause is. So I think it was like different on a case-to-case basis. I think for most cases, basically I only touched stuff which was broken, which like circumvented this whole stuff of how to design it, because I was fairly aware of the issues with that, and that it's like not always too easy to discuss how to approach that then. So I think did some stuff where it's basically just this is broken, how should it be, or like what's the root cause, how did I fix this, how did I approach this, how did I verify it. Like we've got some tests in some areas, in other areas we do not have that many tests, so sometimes I like explained myself a bit more in these cases where I couldn't really test what I was fixing in that at that point. And I think like for the few PRs where I actually added some or like probably the biggest one would be perhaps the minimap PR where I jumped on. I like really got into writing a lot of stuff up and like trying my best to have smaller commits. We've had plenty there, and it also took some time. But like the idea there was that, well, if it's like small and contained, you can just see in the commit message what's happening there and what like the idea is, and also like if I've got some of these in. What basically, why did I do this? How did I approach it? What was the idea behind it? And what did I fix with it? I basically just gave a write-up, so the person on the other side who's reviewing this during their work time, obviously for me was my free times, but they also have to get some time or like reserve some time for reviewing that stuff. That I basically explain my thought process to the best of my ability, which is fine for me. I enjoy doing such things so that they can have a look and know what I'm doing, and it's easier for them to get into what I'm actually doing at that point. I think that's obviously like an opinionated choice, but for me it felt the most reasonable to do, so everyone who has a look at it actually knows what's happening, why it's happening, how I tackle it, and whether there might be a better approach for the issue.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is it's not just about the code that you submit, but it's also about what is the context that you provide about like why you made certain decisions. Like you said, sometimes the issue will say here's the bug and also here's how we want to fix it, but sometimes it'll just be like there's just the description of the bug, maybe not even a root cause, or maybe there's no issue filed at all. You just found the bug and then you went ahead and implemented a fix just for yourself, and you want to contribute that. The words that you put around the code can make a big difference to the person reviewing it in terms of their ability to understand what you were going for and like why you made a decision that maybe wasn't obvious to them since they're not in the code. Peter, I'm curious, like, have you seen the non-code aspects of a pull request or a contribution make a big difference. Any examples you can think of where this was something that if you just saw the code, you might have been like, whoa, I don't know about this one. But because of the explanation around it, you were able to say, oh, you know what? I understand what they're going for. This was maybe counterintuitive, but I now understand, and I actually want to accept this contribution because of the extra context there.
Yeah, I think that in particular, and this goes to whether you're responding to a well-scoped issue that sort of identified the root cause, or whether it's just at best an issue that has some steps to reproduce. But oftentimes having the context of when something broke can be extremely helpful in making sure that you can route this to the correct person. And so not to say that every issue requires a git bisect to really fully identify where it broke, but that a lot of things used to work and got unintentionally broken. And so if you can start with, this was the change that changed this behavior, then any of these there gives this an immediate context of, first of all, it might be appropriate to ping the person who created that PR, or whereas normally sort of pinging random folks is a little over the top. But I think that that's a big one. The other one is with visual changes, and also even small changes, showing the before and after behavior, or a screenshot of that can really go a long way of looking at the code and you've completely refactored the GPUI menuing structure for something. The diff may be actually quite difficult to see what changed. If you added in a layer of nesting, you're changing 40 lines, but really you're only changing one or two. But that having not 100 videos, not 40 screenshots, but a before, after, this syntax highlighting improved. I may not know the tree sitter for your particular pet language, but if you can show me, here's some code that looked ugly before, here's some code that looks better now, then I can evaluate, oh look, you actually, the impact of what's happening here, I think de-risks it, and also makes it easier. If you're being proactive about communicating those details, it means that you're approaching the PR with some empathy for the people who are reviewing it, and that it takes time to review PRs, and acknowledge. Similarly, I appreciate the contributions of folks, but if we both come to the table and say, neither of us want to waste the time of the other. I don't want to lead you down a path and suggest we'll merge something and then say, just kidding, and then close without merging. I also don't want to, if someone throws a PR over the fence with no context that just says fixes blah and is, a 100-line change, it's often very difficult to sort of dive into those details and get motivated on it. But when surrounded by, this was done, I believe, for this, we were trying to fix this problem, or someone was working on this and they accidentally broke that, or, here's why. I think that those links to context are super valuable. The past changes, and also external references of it turns out that this API has this extra field that, Zed is not following the spec or something like that. Those can go a long way, because not everyone has that context at their fingertips. And it means that the more that's documented, either by the original PR opener or by a reviewer, the more likely that someone in the future may also be able to get up to speed on that context. So there's an editor config change where someone's adding a field and you're like, oh, that's actually not part of the spec, but that should be explicit in the PR change. We may still want to do it, but let's be explicit. It's not in the spec. Here's what it looks like. And then as you actually do that, then you go, oops, you implemented the spec wrong. But without the link, you're not going to actually get that sort of review that you're looking for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You hinted at something earlier on in that, which was things not to do. So you mentioned pinging people. So there is definitely a little bit of a subjective measure to this, where on the one hand, if you know that someone might have relevant context and you want to ping them just to mention them, such as, they authored the commit that introduced the regression, there's a nice way you can do that, to be like, hey, just FYI, I saw that, maybe this was on purpose, but it did have this, consequence. But then there's just the classic thing that really irritates me as a reviewer is when I get pinged and there's like 4 other Zed employees being pinged, and it's just someone basically saying, "Hey, pay attention to my thing instead of the other things you're doing." Just to, it's like someone tugging on your pant leg, like, "Hey, come here, look at my thing." That's always frustrating for me because generally speaking, it's like, yeah, I'm aware of your thing. I have other things to do. And so just sort of poking people to say, like, pay attention to my thing instead of other people's things is annoying. But what else comes to mind as sort of things that are good pieces of advice for people not to do? Finn, I don't know if you had any experiences maybe finding these out the hard way. I mean, everybody does, to some extent. But like, yeah,
Well,
what comes to mind?
Well, I think, like, from my experience, I can guarantee you that even if you do not ping anyone, I can assure you within the first 5 minutes, at least 3 people have looked at your PR and will decide on whether they want to tackle it at first or whether they have to wait due to missing context or whatever. It really depends on the issue and, like, the area you're in. I think Peter just mentioned the RSP spec, and we've got some how to call it, protocol sharks, I would suppose. When there's an issue with the protocol, they will take a look. So no worries in that regard, I suppose. But like, and generally, I think we've got like quite a few people who just quite regularly look through PRs and will see what they want to tackle. And as mentioned, like the more context you provide to these or to us in that matter, even if it's obviously your time you have to do for it, but it usually corresponds to stuff getting merged faster, just because it's much easier to review and it's much easier also for people passing by to take a look and well, oh, that was broken recently. Well, that's an easy fix. Just go along with it. I think other than that, it's just I'm not sure what to do. But generally, like the before and after, I'd say it really helps. It's just obviously like you're writing code, but you're like talking or dealing with people on the other side, not machines. At least not yet, but that's definitely like still a few years away, I suppose. But the thing is, like, the more you deal with the people on the other side, because they can see the code, but they can't see you, but they can see how you, like, deal with them, even if it, like, takes... It also, like, personal preference on how you want to approach this, I suppose. But for me, it was like, I know I'm dealing with other people. They have to look at the stuff I'm doing, even if I'm, like, contributing something out of my free time. It's still something where they have to take a look at their time. And if that, like, works on the basis for the stuff if that works with the stuff I'm contributing and, like, I'm getting... I think we've basically already talked about this a bit, but like the more it works for both sides, I think the better it is. And it also definitely leads to stuff getting in faster, the better it's explained and contained and explains why it's doing stuff. I think you can, like, sometimes you can throw some refactorings in if they have a good reason. And if it's like I'm doing something in this crate, oh, and the other crate I noticed. I think that like generally also works. It's just, well, it's not just code, it's just also like dealing with other folks, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right on there of thinking about not just in the text of the body of your PR, but also the diff as with empathy for the person reviewing it, of that sometimes you might have a slightly better way of doing something that changes 40 lines. And if you can optimize towards a reviewable PR, it's everyone involved and that empathy. And related to that, this shouldn't be a hot take, but I think that people should write their own PR descriptions. I don't think that LLMs are the appropriate tool to generate in that maybe if you use an LLM to generate one sentence, I could get on board, but you probably had to write 5 sentences in prompting to get it to that point. And I've been seeing a lot more of this like wall of text, bulleted items of I checked the tests worked, I validated, and it's like, that's what CI is for. Don't tell me that. And one of the things that we sort of optimize again for in our issues and in our PRs is optimizing for the readability of it, not so that the amount of time that will be spent reading the text of a PR is likely more human hours than the time writing it. And so if you put in a little extra time to be tight with your context, it means that if of the 4 or 5 people that might read it, they're more likely to get what you're trying to get at. Whereas if you have a wall of text that, it's like, I don't care that you signed the CLA. We have a CI bot that enforces that. that happens automatically. And that sort of thing. And so I have taken to a few times sort of just like stopping people and be like, try again. This time you write the sentence describing this PR rather than letting, the LLM generate 800 words.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things going on there, which I think are representative of like the broader dynamic. So one of the dynamics here is that as a reviewer, I'm looking for the code, looking through the code and also the context around the code to just try to get a sense of how likely is it that this person was being sloppy and missed something. If the first thing that I see is something that was obviously pasted from an LLM, I'm like, sloppy. So like it just immediately I've moved your PR into a category of like, I need to be extra careful reviewing this thing because it seems like you are taking shortcuts and cutting corners. And therefore, if what I see in your PR kind of trips my radar of like, I'm not so sure about this, I'm much more likely to say, no, thank you. Like, I'm not going to give it as much attention. Whereas if I can tell that this is, a summary of the PR that was written by a human, I'm like, okay, you didn't cut a corner there. You did not cut a corner there, which maybe correlates with you didn't cut corners in the code. So if your code is doing something kind of complicated, I'm less likely to say, I don't know if I want to spend my time reviewing this, and more likely to say, okay, actually, like maybe let me dig in here and try to figure out, is this something that we like really want to accept? I'm not saying I'm going to automatically accept or reject something if it's obviously like an LLM written description, but I would say the same thing goes for the code. Like again, we're looking for markers of sloppiness or like mistakes are likely to have been made here. And there's LLMs leave a comment trail. Like, when they generate code, you can tell there's some comments in there that humans just would not write.
Especially
so again,
given that the style of the Zed code base is relatively light on comments. If you've got a comment on every single line that you're doing, likely you didn't write this and match the style.
Right. Well, and especially at least the current generation of LLMs, they're quite. It's quite common that they will write a comment that references work in progress. So it'll say something like, you'll see a comment that says like, now it does blah, blah, blah instead of blah, blah, blah. It's like, nothing in this diff was doing that old thing. So obviously this is a work in progress comment that the LM, put in for its own benefit. But the point is, again, as a reviewer, this is a marker of this is someone who didn't put a lot of care into this. They didn't put a lot of, detail. They didn't pour over this the way that I'm pouring over this, manually. And as a result, I'm more likely to say, look, I don't want to help you shepherd your, LLM code through this process. I'm more likely to just hit close and, write a comment to you saying like you said, try again or something like that. And I think this goes back to Finn's point about sort of having empathy for the person on the other side of this. There's a human reviewing these code diffs. We don't have LLMs going through and accepting or rejecting PRs. And as a consequence of that, part of having empathy for the person reviewing it is review it yourself first. If you did use an LLM to write your code, before you hit the submit PR button, just go through the code yourself and do those cleanups and do those improvements and, make sure that the code is up to your own standards. Because at the end of the day, what we're accepting or rejecting to the repo has an effect on everybody's code. And so, we want that to be at high quality, and you should want the same thing. Okay, so one more topic I think we should talk about. We've gone through a lot of different things about like what to do, what not to do when you're getting into open source and sort of like the different levels. I think one of the last things that we haven't really talked about is what if you're interested in going from being an open source contributor to an open source employee. So obviously there is sort of a default like hiring process where we have a job posting and stuff like that, and you just apply and go through the interview process and so forth. But at least for Zed, being an open source company, things are a little bit different if you are making open source contributions first. Do we want to talk a little bit about that and sort of how open source can influence the hiring process? Because we just frankly have more information to go on than if the first impression that we're getting of you is the first time we sit down for an interview.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case that on both sides that having the opportunity to collaborate and to submit work to us and also for us to review it is really a unique sort of opportunity that I went back to look at my first PR before I worked at Zed, which was, again, I did a docs PR and then a small, there was Lua was broken on a platform or something like that. And so I fixed it. But I, as a individual, was impressed by the way that Zed folks interacted with me. That there was a quick sort of response. It was very sort of straightforward, and they were like, "Hey, can you add docs? Can you fix this in this other place too?" And it was immediately, it felt much more collaborative and less. I think a lot of open source projects, it can feel like we're just throwing it over the wall on both sides, where there's a quarterly release where we push some change to the GitHub repo, and we pull in some changes occasionally from the community. And I think we try to have a much more permeable barrier there, where we're working on that. And so if you are interested in Zed and working at Zed, or sort of curious about that, I think that it's a unique opportunity to get acquainted with the code base, to sort of dig into some of those details. Also, it is tough to sort of dive into a big code base. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do more of, and is not just the async code reviews, but exposing how we work internally at Zed to some folks from the outside. And so at Zed, we pair heavily. We work together in Zed to work on things, even if it's just pulling someone in to validate, hey, I think this is the design I want to do. Does that make sense? And someone says, no, go way simpler. You don't have to do all that complicated, it's sort of rubber ducking. But I'd like to sort of expand more of that pairing and opportunity for sort of office hours with the community, to expand some of that, so that on both sides we can, both for us to have an insight of what you're capable of if you're somebody who's interested in potentially working at Zed, but also for us to communicate our style of working, and make sure that expectations are managed, that we're whether you work for the company or you're an external contributor, there's an expectation that you can work independently and sort of dig into hard, complex problems. But also, it's okay to ask for help. And I think that that's not every open source project. That's not everything in every project all the time. But I think it is a unique area where Zed recognizes that some of our best employees have come from the community. And so it is worth us spending time to nurture and encourage folks who are in that community, because separate of there's improvements going to Zed, but really the long term of, if we can get someone who's excited about Zed to really sort of ramp up with us, that is it's the win all around. And so
Yeah, great points. Just to be totally clear, for anyone listening, it's not that we require you to contribute. Like I didn't contribute to Zed Codebase at all before I joined, for example. But also worth noting that just getting into open source in general can help out in other ways. For example, Zed is my first full-time Rust job. But when I was applying to Zed, I was able to point to the 300,000 line of code Rust repo that I've been working on in my spare time for the past 4 years, as evidence of the fact that, hey, I can write Rust code, and in fact, you can go look at my Rust code, and you don't have to take my word for it. Now, granted, there's a very valid point, which is people shouldn't have to program outside of work to get ahead in their careers. But at the same time, it's also just unavoidably true that as a team that's trying to find good people, and it's hard and time consuming to interview people, if we have more data points on you, we're going to use them. So if we have more data points on open source contributions you've made to other projects, or even better, open source contributions you've made to Zed, unavoidably, that's just going to give you an advantage, all else being equal. Having said that, again, we do not require that. We've hired plenty of people who have no open source, Rust contributions or no open source Zed contributions. Not a requirement, but it's unavoidably going to be an advantage.
I definitely encourage folks to check out some of our reach out to us on Discord if you're getting involved with this stuff, and if you're looking for help. They're both from Zed staff and from other members of the community. There are folks who can, if you have questions about how we operate, it's okay to speak up, and folks will sort of say, oh, preview releases go out every other week, or, it's not abnormal for a PR to sit unreviewed for 3 or 4 days, or something like that, and understanding those workflows. The other thing is, I hope folks reach out to us in our other avenues of we at RustConf and in other settings where we're around. We like to talk to our users a lot, and so whether you're contributing, whether you're just a user who, wants to do that. We very much appreciate the empathy and the sort of reaching out to us as human beings and talking to us.
Nice. Finn, any parting advice for people looking to get into this stuff?
Yeah, I think we can. It's like one thing to keep in mind. I think we do our best in getting back to PRs, but it can depend. That it sometimes takes longer, and it definitely sometimes takes longer than it should. I think I can tell from experience also in a few, but I think at the same time, please keep in mind we do our best. It's not always working. It's probably we do say it's not the best thing, and eventually we'll get to it if it's open. So no worries there. But please keep in mind we do our best. It's also really looking for a reason in some devices. I would also say it's probably also something to keep in mind. But we do our best, but it's still an effort, and it's still a lot, especially also across the extensions, and also to get to wrap your head around. So as we talked about, the more context we have and the easier it is to review, the faster it will probably get in. I think.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate
Richard.
you taking the time, and hope this is useful to anyone looking to get into open source.